On the 8th of August 2021, off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida, the first in a new class of aircraft carriers for the United States Navy is completing her shock trials in readiness for service. The USS Gerald R Ford, along with the sister ships of her class, will lead the US Navy well into the 21st century as a potent symbol of American global power at sea. However, it was exactly 110 years earlier in a Californian shipyard that the origins of America's long line of aircraft carriers began. This is the story of America's first aircraft carrier, USS Langley. By the end of World War I, the aeroplane was proving itself to be a very useful asset to the military. The British Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service had amalgamated on the 1st of April 1918 to create the Royal Air Force, and they were developing new aircraft for a range of new military purposes. The Royal Navy had previously been using float planes out at sea, using specially modified ships as seaplane tenders, catapulting aircraft into the air and then using cranes to recover them. By the closing stages of the war, aircraft development had progressed rapidly, and land-based aircraft on wheeled undercarriage were starting to impress. The Royal Navy had an urgent desire to get these new aircraft out to sea. Their solution was to take an ocean liner that was under construction and fit a full-length flight deck to it to allow wheel-based aircraft to take off and land. The resultant HMS Argus was the world's first full-length flight deck aircraft carrier, commissioned on the 16th of September 1918. Across the Atlantic Ocean, none of this had gone unnoticed. The United States had contributed to the cost of the war using the US Navy's aviation program, primarily being used for scouting missions and directing naval vessels onto German submarine targets. And they were now looking to develop their own at-sea airborne capability. Taking inspiration from the British approach, rather than design and build a vessel from scratch, they looked to adapt an existing hull. Since the advent of steam-powered ships in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the US Navy had a fleet of ships with the job of carrying the essential fuel of coal, as well as other supplies, out to steam-powered ships at sea, removing the constant need for ships to put back into port repeatedly and taking them off station. These ships were known as Colliers, and they were largely converted cargo ships following acquisition by the Navy. But in the early years of the 20th century, the Navy were building purpose-built colliers. One such class of collier was the Proteus class, and was made up of USS Proteus, USS Cyclops, USS Nereus, and USS Jupiter. And it was the latter, USS Jupiter, that would eventually be chosen for conversion. The keel of USS Jupiter was laid down on the 18th of October 1911 at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, California, and on the 14th of August the following year, she was launched. Following fitting out and successful completion of her sea trials, she was commissioned into service on the 7th of April 1913. The length of USS Jupiter was 542 feet. Her beam was 65 feet 5 inches, and she had a draft of 27 feet 8 inches. She was the first US Navy vessel to have a General Electric turbo-electric transmission, which enabled a top speed of 15 knots, and whilst cruising at 10 knots, she had a range of 3,500 nautical miles. For protection, she was fitted with 4 4-inch guns. The first active service of USS Jupiter began under the command of Commander Joseph M. Reeves in April of 1914 and was based out of San Francisco with the United States Marine Corps as part of the Pacific Fleet, where she formed part of the US naval strength during the tensions with Mexico and the Veracruz crisis. She remained in the Pacific until that October, when she became the first vessel to transit from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean through the new Panama Canal en route to Philadelphia, and a service with the Atlantic Fleet Auxiliary Division. April 6, 1917. The United States declares war on the German Empire, and USS Jupiter is called straight into service, being assigned to the Naval Overseas Transport Service and is Europe-bound. Her first voyage would give an early indication to her aviation future, as she was tasked with transporting a naval aviation detachment of 122 men and 7 officers to England. This detachment was commanded by Lieutenant Kenneth Whiting and would be the first of a very long line of American aviators to serve in Europe. Following the war, there was an increasing trend for coal-fired ships to be converted into oil-burning ships, and this was creating a surplus of collier vessels in service with the Navy. USS Jupiter by now, having finished transatlantic repatriations of US servicemen, was back operating off the United States west coast, whilst at the same time, plans were being investigated to convert a surplus collier into the United States' first ever aircraft carrier. Since 1916, Lieutenant Kenneth Whiting had been advocating plane carriers for the US Navy, but had not enjoyed any political support, having his proposal to acquire a ship with flight deck and aircraft catapult officially rejected on June 20, 1917. After the war, however, newly promoted Lieutenant Commander Whiting was assigned to the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, D.C., and along with other leading figures in aviation, found himself to be in a much stronger position to lobby the General Board of the United States Navy in the need for the US Navy to have aircraft carriers. He finally got his way, and in April 1919, the General Board officially submitted its recommendation to the US Congress that the Collier USS Jupiter be converted into an aircraft carrier. On July 11, 1919, Congress agreed. USS Jupiter would become USS Langley, named for the American aviation pioneer Samuel Pierpont Langley, and designated CV-1. USS Jupiter made her final voyage when she sailed to Virginia and the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, where the Collier was decommissioned on the 24th of March 1920, and the conversion work began. The Washington Naval Treaty was just around the corner, and this would result in the limiting of size of the US Navy as well as other major global powers. But it did allow exceptions when it came to experimental aircraft carriers, either existing ships or ships yet to be built. It was accepted that USS Langley was never going to be the fastest in the water, but she was chosen to be an experimental testbed, along with the fact that as a collier she had large available storage space, ideal for storing aircraft. The treaty would also mean that the two planned battleships of USS Lexington and USS Saratoga would have to be redesigned as permitted aircraft carriers, and these two ships would end up being the main combatants. Langley's two smokestacks had to be reconfigured to the side to allow for the fitting of a full-length flight deck, which incorporated an aircraft catapult for takeoffs and a resting gear for landings, as well as an elevator for transporting aircraft from the hangar deck to the flight deck. She had her defensive armaments upgraded also, replacing her 4 4-inch guns with 4 5-inch guns. Following conversion on the 20th of March 1922, USS Langley CV-1 was recommissioned into service, fittingly under the command of one Commander Kenneth Whiting. As USS Langley was the first aircraft carrier, she would be the setting for many naval and aviation firsts. On the 17th of October 1922, a Vought VE-7 piloted by Lieutenant Virgil C. Griffin was the first aircraft to be launched from Langley's deck. Just 9 days later, having tried many aircraft takeoffs, Lieutenant Commander Godfrey de Courcelles Chevalier brought in his Aeromarine 39B for Langley's first landing. There was now just one more experiment to conduct, and on the 18th of November, none other than Commander Whiting became the first US naval aviator to be catapulted from the deck of an aircraft carrier. In the first 6 months of 1923, Langley was carrying out extensive flight operation tests in the Caribbean Sea, and by now was becoming very proficient at it. So much so that in June 1923 she would sail up the US East Coast on a publicity cruise to show off this new naval capability. Following a display in Washington, D.C. before civil and military dignitaries, she displayed to the public at stops in Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts and New York City. Flying displays over the city would take place, but the main star of the attraction was the flight deck takeoff and landings. It was soon learned, however, that a carrier at anchor and with little headwind would make non-catapult launches quite difficult. But the pilots of the Vought VE-7s were confident that takeoff speed could be reached in the space available and avoid hitting the water. 1924 would see USS Langley carry out more exercises and exhibitions before having some repairs and modifications made back at the Norfolk shipyards. and by November of 1924, she was heading back to the west coast in San Diego to join the Pacific Battle Fleet, where, but for a brief excursion to Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in 1927, she would remain until 1936, carrying out further experimentation and pilot training. On the 25th of October 1936, USS Langley's career as an aircraft carrier was over. The 1924 Vinson-Trammell Act was freeing up many of the restrictions of the Washington Naval Treaty, but also adding some other restrictions in other areas, namely aircraft carriers. Because the US wanted to build more aircraft carriers, to make space under the new treaty, it was decided to convert Langley into a seaplane tender. She may no longer carry the CV designator, but her trailblazing had been essential in the operational development of USS Lexington and USS Saratoga. Her conversion was carried out at her birthplace of Mare Island, California, and involved the removal of half of her flight deck, and on the 11th of April 1937 she was assigned the hull designation number AV3, and she re-entered service. This may have seemed like a backward step for America's first aircraft carrier, but she was to be kept very busy, operating with the Aircraft Scouting Force, working in the waters off Alaska, Seattle, Pearl Harbor and California. Between February and July of 1939, she was back operating in the Atlantic, before being ordered to sail east to the Philippines, to begin service with the United States Asiatic Fleet. She arrived there on the 24th of September 1939. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japanese forces and the subsequent entry of the US into World War II, USS Langley now commenced wartime operations and was based out of Cavite in the Philippines. The following day, 8th of December 1941, Japan invaded the Philippines, and so Langley departed Cavite and sailed first for the Dutch East Indies and the port city of Balikpapan, but the escalating Japanese activity forced her to continue her journey onto Australia, arriving in Darwin on the 1st of January 1942. An Allied naval coalition was formed between the American, British, Dutch and Australian, and Langley took up her role within this organisation and began working alongside the Royal Australian Air Force, carrying out anti-submarine patrols. In February 1942, Langley was tasked with visiting Fremantle, Western Australia, to collect 32 Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters of the Far East Air Force, along with pilots and ground crews of the US Army Air Force. Whilst at Fremantle, she was joined by the cargo ship Sea Witch, who had on board a further 27 P-40s. Following the loading of their cargoes, they were to join convoy MS-5 that was bound for Ceylon. The convoy consisted of US Army transport Willard A. Holbrook and the Australian troop transport Katoomba and Duntroon, along with a military escort of light cruiser USS Phoenix. The convoy set sail for Ceylon on the 22nd of February 1942. Whilst en route to Ceylon, Langley and Sea Witch were given orders to leave the main convoy and head for Tiohtià:ke in Java to deliver their cargoes. On the morning of the 27th of February, Langley was met by the destroyers USS Whipple and USS Edsall, which had been dispatched from Java to accompany Langley into port. However, high above the formation, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had spotted them and was relaying their position back to base. At 11:40 AM, when they were 75 miles out of Java, 16 Mitsubishi G4M bombers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, accompanied by 15 A6M0 fighters, commenced an attack. During the first two bomb runs, Langley was able to change course and avoided being hit. But on the third run, the Japanese aircraft simply chose to drop all remaining bombs onto all the possible evasions that Langley could choose to make. Therefore, try as she might, she could not avoid being hit 5 times by a mix of 550-pound and 130-pound bombs. 16 crew on board were killed in the attack. Langley was seriously damaged, her flight deck ablaze, steering non-functional and a 10-degree list to port. Her engine room rapidly flooded and she came to a halt. At 1:32 PM, the order was given to abandon ship. USS Whipple took on board 308 survivors, with USS Edsall taking a further 177. Fearing that Langley could end up in Japanese hands, it was decided to fire 9 4-inch shells and 2 torpedoes into Langley's hull. This they did at 2:29 p.m, sending the veteran Collier and pioneering aircraft carrier to the sea floor. Langley's survivors were transferred to the oiler USS Pecos, who had arrived to assist the rescue operation. Whilst Pecos was en route to Australia, she too came under attack by Japanese carrier aircraft. Following 3 attacks over the course of a couple of hours, USS Pecos sank. Hearing Pecos's distress calls, USS Whipple raced to the scene and was able to rescue 232 survivors. Approximately 400 men were still in the water and could be seen by Whipple. However, possible detection of enemy submarines in the area resulted in the agonising decision to abandon them and return to Australia. USS Edsall, carrying 31 United States Army Air Force pilots rescued from Langley, also responded to the distress calls, but was attacked by enemy battleships and was sunk with the loss of all on board, either due to the sinking or by the Japanese as prisoners of war. USS Langley may have had a tragic end with the loss of so many men, but she will long be remembered for the pioneering role she carried out in developing aircraft carrier operations and providing early naval aviators with their skills. As aircraft continue to develop, so too do their carriers into the formidable machines they are today, maintaining peace through strength across the globe. For the United States of America, it all began with a humble Collier. Thanks very much for watching. Please hit the like button and consider subscribing.